Welcome back to the Refreshing Leadership Podcast with me, Maya Gudka. Last week, I was joined by the executive relationship strategist, Katarina Polonska. We talked about something that has a huge impact on leadership performance and overall quality of life, but it doesn't necessarily get spoken about in leadership spaces or spoken about openly. And that is the quality of our intimate relationships, our partnerships, our marriages. And in today's conversation, we take that one step deeper. We talk about the different dynamics that can emerge between ambitious partners, the hidden tensions that can emerge in dual career households in particular, and why so many couples will drift into parent-child dynamics. We also talk about something super practical, which is the idea of relational hygiene. Tiny but important practices or rituals that can stop resentment or distance from building up over time. So I think this is going to be a really good addition to what we set up last time, but give us some really practical things to walk away with. So I hope you will share this episode with your partner and have a go at some of these practices. We're looking for the things that can refresh our leadership at work, but we're also looking at the things that are going to refresh our overall lives, and building in a few of these practices ahead of time, perhaps at a time when your relationship is actually thriving, could be the thing that really makes it robust and protects it going forward. So I hope that you find the tips in here helpful today. Let's dive into today's conversation. Katarina, welcome back to the Refreshing Leadership Podcast.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back. Thank you for having me.
Last time we talked about some of the typical dynamics that can emerge. And one thing that I wanted to ask you a bit more about was maybe the differences that you see between the genders when it comes to this relational stuff. For example, you described the scenario of the male founder with the stay-at-home wife and the kids, and it sounded like people can feel quite trapped in everything that they have created, right?
Yeah.
What do you see then from the female perspective when you're working with, perhaps starting initially with working with the female in the relationship?
Yeah, great question. It's interesting because I see very similar patterns. And one of my arguments in all of my gender work that I have done academically is actually that, yes, there are socially constructed differences, but on that very human level, we're quite similar. There's so many similarities. And the women that I tend to work with are in a similar role of often being the breadwinner, I'll correct that. The women who come to me initially, because very often I will work with the main ambitious breadwinner type, and then later down the line, their partner will work with me as well. So that does happen. And obviously they're kind of in a very different situation. But the women who voluntarily come work with me are typically, yes, breadwinners, the responsible one of the relationship, the one who's really carrying that mental and emotional load of providing for the family, of thinking through the finances, of managing all of the logistics, and also navigating the kids and navigating the domestic space. There's a lot on their shoulders. And very often what I find is that if she is earning enough to actually provide for the whole family, he very often will actually stay home and be the stay-at-home husband or stay-at-home father. There's a lot of work involved there, and actually a lot of challenge from a gender role perspective that he might be going through. And what tends to happen is, because as women, we are so conditioned into being the nurturers, into being the empaths, and then you're in this very responsible breadwinning role, we can end up creating this dynamic. And I say we because I absolutely did this with my own husband, where we start to create a relationship where we are the ones who are really taking charge of everything in the relationship, in the home, in the workplace, in all arenas. And our partner ends up feeling a little bit disenfranchised. Maybe they start to lose their sense of purpose. Maybe they start to really fixate on the kids and on you as being their main source of joy, of purpose. And in that, we actually end up disempowering them, and we end up disempowering ourselves because we end up overextending ourselves and becoming this figure who is really carrying everything and not giving them the space to carry their own fair share. And that's not to say that raising the kids and staying home isn't your fair share. What I'm talking about more here is the purpose, that sense of who's actually leading this relationship. we really do need both parties to lead the relationship. Because when one person is leading it almost exclusively, you start to get this parent-child dynamic where you have the parent, very often it'll be the female, but it can also be the male, who is doing everything, including leading on the intimacy, including leading on the communication, including leading on the family holidays, leading on when we're going to pay the bills, leading on everything. And then you get this child-like response in return, where you end up feeling, you've got another child on your hands. They're not really contributing that much. Yes, they're providing for the kids or looking after the kids and picking them up from school. But again, what else can they be doing? And what often happens there is you start to get rebellious behaviors, right? So an interesting trend that I see a lot of is that the person who's a stay-at-home partner might develop an addiction, right? Because they feel lonely, they feel disconnected. They don't really have an outlet, they don't really have a purpose. And so addictive behaviors are quite common. There can be this kind of rebellious backlash against the primary breadwinner's work, this resentment of their work. I had one founder client who told me that the day he had an exit and he came home with a check for essentially $300 million, his wife took the car, crashed it, got blackout drunk, and was extremely upset by it. And again, there's not to go into the whole weeds of what was happening, but she'd really been neglected and disempowered her whole marriage with him, right? The work was center stage, and there wasn't much consideration given to her and how she had to move across the country to facilitate his company and his growth. And she's very much left behind in the discourse on what actually makes them happy as a family, as a couple. So we get this kind of power imbalance that can happen. And it doesn't work for either person, because the person who's actually leading and being the responsible one and the breadwinner starts to feel tired, starts to feel trapped, starts to feel resentful, starts to lose attraction to the person who's staying home, because why would you be attracted to this kind of childlike figure that you've created? And ultimately, you are complicit in creating this dynamic. Meanwhile, the person who's staying at home starts to also become resentful because no one wants to date their parent, starts to feel like they're trapped because they don't really have their own livelihood, they don't really have their own purpose, they don't really have their own life. And it's really dysfunctional. But both people are complicit within it. Right. And so again, it's very easy to point the blame and say, I wish my partner had more purpose. I wish my partner would earn some money. I wish my partner would get a job. But you've created this dynamic. So it's on you to look at, where have you sabotaged on some unconscious level intimacy in your life to end up being this leader who's ultimately in control of another person, right? It's uncomfortable, but we do it. I certainly did it.
What about when it's, so the example is there quite a lot about a breadwinner and a stay at home, whether that is a gender reversal or not. What about when it both parties, for example, in my case, both of us are ambitious working people in the relationship, and probably what a lot of my peers and friends and mum friends will find themselves in these shoes of both being working parents. Does that dynamic come through, or are you maybe in your work seeing some of the more extremes where that it's more of the breadwinner and the stay-at-home dynamic? Because actually what crosses my path, because I'm working with a lot of leaders inside organizations, is probably the dual track, dual career. Whereas maybe in your founder examples, there is a more extreme, because it is such a demanding.
I see the dual track as well. Absolutely. And when we have a dual track, similar patterns start to develop. It's less about the power imbalance, but it can become a power struggle. It can become a competition, right, around whose work has precedence. It's really what I witnessed with my own parents, who were both very ambitious people, two separate tracks. And in the end, it was a question of, well, what country do we move to? Whose career gets to have priority here? They're both extremely passionate, ambitious people. And at the crux of it, someone had to essentially kind of choose their career over the relationship. That can happen. There's also very little breathing room within that to focus on the relationship, right? So one thing, my husband's an entrepreneur, I'm an entrepreneur. One of the things that we've structurally really had to integrate into our relationship is non-negotiable windows in our calendar that are very tempting to override a lot of the time, especially, days like today when I'm back to back to back to back to back and I'm flying tomorrow. But we have to have these sacred moments where it's not just a 30-minute check-in, it's multiple hours of really being present, of really having good relational hygiene to actually clear any stuck resentments, any bits of baggage that we might be accumulating along the way, to have these deeper, vulnerable conversations, and to really keep checking in with, are we actually growing together or are we growing apart? And that requires in many ways more work than if you're just in a standard kind of 9 to 5 dynamic where, you both come home and you can switch off from work and not really worry about it. It's a lot of effort. Healthy relationships are not for the faint-hearted. I often say it's much easier to be in a really toxic, unhealthy relationship because you get to check out, right? You get to kind of switch off and just float along and let it be toxic. But a healthy, conscious, fulfilling, nourishing relationship really requires you to lean in. And when you're two busy professionals, that's adding in many ways more work to your plate. But the trade-off is you live longer, you're healthier, you're happier, you actually go on to make more money, you have a safe space to land, you have someone to ideate with you, someone to share your thoughts, your concerns, your visions, your dreams, your hopes with. It's much better for you long term, but it does require that discipline. And that's where no one really taught us this. So when I see couples who are very busy and ambitious, and structurally they're living two separate lives and they start to grow apart, it makes complete sense to me. No one ever taught you the importance of having this relational hygiene or how to even do it, right? No one ever taught us. And that's where society's gone very wrong.
Yeah. Tell us what relational hygiene is. How would you define that?
I'll tell you what I do. So no, you first have to know what you're solving for. So what is relational hygiene? It's about recognizing, okay, am I projecting in anything? Am I projecting my own wounds, my own patterns, my own blocks, my own stuff onto my partner that is making me not see them and the relationship clearly? That's one piece. And that's on you, right? That's really on you both individually to check in with yourselves on, am I actually seeing this clearly? The second part is, am I carrying any resentment? It's very natural to start to accumulate resentment over the days, over the weeks. So you have to know, am I carrying any of that? Am I carrying anything that actually maybe I haven't said to my partner? Am I carrying any boundary violations? Is there anything here that's making me feel a little bit off, that maybe is upsetting me, maybe hurting me, maybe something that's just creating a little bit of that resistance between me and them? You have to look out for that. The third part is there anything that I need from my partner? Maybe there's something that I need from them that I haven't voiced, that they aren't aware of, that I'm not getting. The fourth part is there anything I feel unappreciated for? Is there anything that I need them to actually appreciate me for? Because maybe they don't see it, but I would really like their validation for it. That is a snapshot, right, of like 4 things to think about from a relational hygiene perspective. Then there's obviously intimacy building and communication and a ton of other practices. And so every couple is going to be different. But you want to start to build these pieces into your calendar, into your routine, where they become these non-negotiable points of connection and points of clearing. And it might sound like a lot of work, but it's really not. So if I talk about what I do with my husband, every 2 weeks, we have a 1-hour relationship practice where we check in with each other. It could be when we're on a walk. It could be on a Sunday morning when we're just in bed. It could be anything. And we have a structured dialogue that we go through to help each other understand, is there anything I need, anything I'm afraid of, anything that I appreciate you for, anything that I really loved about you in the past 2 weeks, and anything that I would like more of. So we kind of go through these different prompts, and it's a safe space. We're allowed to bring anything to the table. We have amnesty at that point. So it can be something quite controversial. It can be something scary, but we know that it's safe. And every 2 weeks we get this clearing. There's also every night, it's quite sweet actually. We have a little appreciation practice where before we go to bed, it takes us 2 minutes. We just ask each other, is there anything you want to feel appreciated for today that I haven't appreciated you for? Right? And it could be something that's like, today, for example, it might be, I'm stressed out of my skin because I'm back to back to back and I'm flying tomorrow and I've got so many things to do and I'm holding it all together. I'm still showing up. We've still got like a 2-hour date night tonight. I'm still here. I'm still present. I want to be appreciated for that. And for him, it might be the stress he has at work. Once he told me, I want to be appreciated for the fact that I even work. Don't always love it, but the fact that I'm here and I'm showing up and I'm, my husband would much rather be somewhere in Latin America owning land and running retreats or, whatever it is that he wants to do. So that's a really great little practice. So that's one thing we do.
I just need to pause there because I think that one really speaks to the different things that I have brought in to ask you about today, which is, when you're sharing the domestic load, when you're raising the family, and you might not be in the honeymoon years pre-kids, and you're still very much in the thick of it, and you still got many other things on. Actually, this for me is one of those questions, like a magic question, that could really do the trick,
Yeah.
because it turns something that otherwise, like you say, could be a resentment into something positive. What you appreciate appreciates. And so I'm actually going to go and take that one away. And I think that's going to be so powerful, because I'm not one to carry resentments. I'm very direct. So that's not something
Mhm.
that I have as an issue.
Mhm.
But I
Mhm.
do like to be seen and appreciated. And I think this is such a nice way of doing that. And because I do that, then my husband also wants to make sure that he feels like that. And
Yeah.
so I really like it for those reasons.
Yeah,
Love it.
brilliant. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great little practice. Now I could go on, there's other practices around the kind of date nights that you have and what does a date night even include, right? You might have very different ideas to your partner. For some people, a date night might be just watching TV together. Another person's date night might be, I want to be consciously looking into your eyes over a glass of wine. And, everyone's going to have their own ideas. So you have to be clear on what that date night is. You have to be clear on the frequency of date nights. People are going to have different needs for connection. So both of you should get on the same page with that, because what's easy to happen is that you want to have date nights twice a week. Your partner's happy to have it once a month. You're at two very different levels. You don't talk about it. And then resentment starts to build up and distance starts to build up. There's also patterns around intimacy, right? Literally physical intimacy. Unfortunately, you probably have to schedule it in, which isn't very romantic to many people, but I would argue it's actually very romantic because you're making it a priority, right? And then there's conversation around, like, how do you want to do that? Having just a little, again, 30-minute window once every 2 weeks is not going to cut it for most people, right? So there's a dialogue around that. So really there's these different pieces and different structures that you get to decide as an individual on what's important for you in your own little cocktail of what makes a happy, healthy, nourishing relationship for you. And you get to build those in. For me, nature's a big part of it, right? I need to know that once a month, I have at least 3 to 4 hours of consolidated deep nature time where we're off grid, no phones. I live in Vancouver, as you know, and we have that very earthy connection time together, right? For my husband, it's socializing with other people. He loves, for some reason I don't quite understand, but he loves seeing me with other people, interacting and laughing, and kind of being in group hangouts. Okay. I don't have that same need, but he does. So we build it in. So there's a kind of problem solving logistical element here, which I actually quite love because my problem solving brain kicks in to create the conditions to have that relationship so that when life happens, you have these foundational pieces to
That's
carry you through.
that's so nice. And I love the way you've given these two very clear examples of the different things that you need in that relationship.
Yes.
My final question for you, because I'm conscious of our time, is, do you see there being phases in relationships? I mean, as in, I know there are, but in your work, do you come across these different phases? So perhaps, as I described, there might be a phase before kids. There might be a phase when you're really in the thick of it. There may be one after that, or do you maybe then contemplate empty nesting and things like that? And do you see there being different things needed in the relationship hygiene at those different stages?
Great
Any comments on that?
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. There are absolutely stages, and the stages are kind of non-negotiable stages that every couple has to go through. You have the dating phase, which is self-explanatory. You have the honeymoon phase where you're together and you're, filled with this wonderful cocktail of hormones and you've got rose-tinted glasses and everything's amazing. Then you have the power struggle phase, which is a really normal, healthy phase that we all go through, where you begin to renegotiate your own identity. You start to assert your real needs. You take the mask off of the little perfect version of you that you showed up with at the beginning when you're dating. This often happens after we're married, after we've made that commitment, that you start to relax a little bit and your real self comes out, your needs come out, boundaries, your interests, your need for space. And naturally there starts to be a bit of a tension and a power struggle dynamic of, well, who gets to win here, right? And it's less about winning. It's more about, can we learn to negotiate through this? Can we learn to communicate through this? Can we learn to navigate conflict? Can we learn to actually configure our lives to ensure that we're both fulfilled and we have a healthy interdependence? The power struggle phase is a really important phase where you might want to get help. You might want to work with a coach or a therapist, whoever it might be, to help you learn these fundamental skills to reconfigure your dynamic into one that's actually sustainable. And then once you've done that, if you don't break up in that time frame, because a lot of people will break up, if you can get through that, then you go into the stability phase and the bliss phase where you get to have all the perks of the honeymoon phase. Only now you have two separate identities. What can happen is that the power struggle will come back. It'll come back if you get a new job, perhaps. It'll come back if you have kids. It'll come back if you're empty nesters. Any of these big changes where the status quo is disrupted, where maybe there's growth, you're going to have to renegotiate your identity and your role within the relationship, what you need, and what you've experienced. And again, most people do not have the capabilities to do this well. And what they find is that they're in a lot of conflict, there's a lot of arguments, a lot of tension, and they assume my partner's changed, I've outgrown them, we have to break up. That's not always the case. It can be the case, but it's not always the case. And so my invitation to people is get the help, do it preemptively, do it ahead of time if you can do, so that you have these tools and strategies and techniques to support you when the going gets tough, because it will get tough and that's just life.
I think that's a great way to wrap this up. And I don't know if you read Caitlin Moran, but I always remember something that she said, which was that, to all her ambitious high achievers, what she would tell them like 20 years ago is that your relationship can have the biggest impact on your career, and especially if you have kids. So I think it's so important. And yet when things are pretty nice and fine, it can be easy to take it for granted and, just not do the hygiene. So I think this is a wake up call to remind us that we do actually need to do some of this hygiene work and get the help as well. So thank you so much for sharing all of this. It has been really illuminating and also just lovely to meet you for the first time and connect with you. It's such a fun way to be able to do that. So remind listeners where they can come across your work and how they can find you and hear more from you.
Absolutely. So if you head over to my website, www.katarinapolonska.com, you can find links to book a call with me directly. I'm still doing that right now. You can find my LinkedIn there, I believe you can. I have a blog that I'm very active on. I have my podcast there that you can dive into, the Successfully in Love podcast. And if you want to find me on social media, head over to LinkedIn. So type in Katarina Polonska, you'll find me there. Drop me a message, follow my content. I post once a day at least, if not twice a day. You can also find me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all the social medias. And don't be a stranger, reach out. I would love to hear more about what's going on for you.
Brilliant. Thank you again for joining us. And thank you for listening today. And if this has struck a nerve, or you think you were thinking of somebody as you were listening to this that could really benefit, or send this to your partner, make this a couple listen, so that you both actually get a chance to benefit from this and then work on it together. This is one of those episodes. I've done a few others like this when we've talked about finance for couples and things like this. This is probably a good one to share with your partner. So I'll leave it there. And thanks for listening again. And thank you, Katarina. It has been an absolute pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me.